Why are people with an anxious, preoccupied attachment style so often people pleasers? And how can this negatively affect your relationship? And what can you do about it? That's what we're going to cover in today's video. Hey everyone, I'm Sonia. Welcome to my channel where I strive to give you tips and strategies to have your best life and relationships. I am a life coach, a Wayfinder life coach, and also I am an IAT certified attachment style coach. So if you need any help with any of that, perhaps get on my newsletter below. And you can always book a 20-minute session so I can see if I can help you in any way, including, working with me, but also that I might be able to point you to some other resources as well. Because of course I've done my own deep dives that eventually led to my trainings and all of this. And I am a healed FA myself. All right. So today, I wanted to talk about the anxious preoccupied attachment style in particular, which is pretty well known for being people pleasers. They're very oriented towards connection, but often that can look like prioritizing other people over themselves, things like that. And I want to talk about how that can sometimes be difficult in a relationship, how that can actually cause problems, and then some tips for what to do about it. Okay, so why is this? Why does it develop that someone with an anxious, preoccupied attachment style might tend to be more of a people pleaser? So one of the top core wounds for an anxious, preoccupied person is I will be abandoned. So there is a tendency towards, being triggered to be concerned that someone will abandon them. And when we say abandon, that doesn't necessarily mean physical abandonment, even in the sense of like completely ending a relationship. It can be the feeling of not feeling connected with them if the other person feels like they're withdrawing, for example. So it can be in these emotional ways, in addition to actually like the severing of a relationship where it's much more actually physical or more conclusive kind of thing, right? It can be somewhat more moment to moment or in terms of someone's attitude towards them, that kind of thing. So this I will be abandoned core wound, whatever flavor that comes in. Some people don't identify with that exact wording, but the fact that that can get triggered, and we don't like it when our core wounds are triggered, so we often try to avoid that. Our subconscious will lead us towards that core wound not getting touched, does mean that an anxious preoccupied person in general is going to be really trying to work with the other person to the extent that they might abandon themselves, actually, right? And not listen to their own wants and needs as much. And so that is classic people pleasing that then it develops into. And needs, of course, fit into this as well, because an anxious preoccupied person often does have a very strong need for connection and being around other people. And it's a beautiful thing in a lot of ways, right? But there can be challenges in getting that need met. And so sometimes to meet that need, the anxious preoccupied person, might go out of their way for someone else. And it can be, partly to connect with the other person by giving, and perhaps to expect, from which starts to get into codependency a little bit, but to then hope for the reciprocation of what they did for someone else. And so that's how it can get into people pleasing, is both in sort of the doing for other people, the prioritizing other people over themselves, and in being conflict avoidant as well, in order to not have the other person be mad at them, and then potentially that it severs the connection in some way. And then, as happens, right, like as someone goes along, they have this lens of being fear of abandonment, and so it tends to, as someone grows and has experiences, often this starts in childhood or with something with our family dynamic or something we've gone through as a child, but as it goes in time, we develop that lens. We develop that it feels safe to be a people pleaser, which is what we're familiar with already. And so all of it just sort of settles in unless we do a lot of work around changing that and those patterns. So I want to talk about how this can be a problem, sort of how this then develops into being a problem very specifically. You may sort of be starting to see why it can be a problem already. But before I do that, I also want to mention that it is genuinely also a good thing, right? These flavors of each of the insecure attachment styles that come out, they're not all bad, right? It's wonderful that anxious, preoccupied people do want to be so connective, and they also are often are part of the social glue holding groups together, for example. So it's not all bad. And I also want to point out that it's genuine, right? Like I just said the thing about sometimes people maybe give hoping to get, and that sounds sort of calculated, right? Like I said, it can start to get into codependency if it goes too far. But I'm going to liken it to studies they've done of pro-social behavior in general. So pro-social behavior, they'll talk about, and not incorrectly, that it's been this great evolutionary advantage. So they'll talk about it in these ways where they're talking about advantages to the individual or to the group. But does that mean the experience of someone actually doing it means that they don't want to do it? I don't think that's the same thing. I don't think it's the same thing to say because there are benefits of something that someone doesn't genuinely also want to do it. So it's more complicated than that, I think. And so I think just to give credit where credit's due to start here, I think that it often is very well-meaning and genuine from an anxious, preoccupied person when they do care a lot about other people. However, that doesn't mean it can't sometimes lead to going too far in certain ways with it and causing problems. So let's talk about that next. The problem comes when it leads to a lack of assertiveness, a lack of getting one's own needs met, a lack of taking oneself into account. That's really what it comes down to. It's not that we can't take other people into account, and in fact, that's a beautiful thing. But are we taking ourselves into account? Is an anxious, preoccupied person taking themselves into account? And when they don't, it can lead to a whole manner of problems, right? A whole host of problems. If someone is not saying what their needs are, and that's building up over time, that definitely can lead to things like resentment. Anxious, preoccupied people sometimes can be quite critical of their partners, either more overtly or becoming passive aggressive about it. And that can be the frustration with not getting needs met. But sometimes, most often, they haven't actually been assertive about asking for them themselves, right? So it can lead to relationship conflict. It can lead to frustration, with not getting the needs met, and dissatisfaction with life and relationships. And, sometimes it can lead to other behaviors because of suppressing, right? Like if a need or emotion or pushback or all of that is always suppressed, that can come out sometimes in other ways, or it can be that someone's really trying to suppress their behavior. Or habit, so there's all manner of ways, both relationally and individually, that being a people pleaser, that often anxious preoccupieds are, can lead to problems. And of course, it means that if you think of an anxious preoccupied person going into a particular interaction and not bringing themselves up, not putting themselves into account in the negotiation or whatever's happening, it really does reinforce then still even more this insecure kind of attachment, because they are perceiving that they are not having their need met, which in a way is a form of abandonment. They're also self-abandoning because they're not taking themselves into account, which is self-abandonment. So that core wound actually is getting re-triggered, sometimes very subconsciously, and that's just leading to that insecure attachment style really just continuing to be more and more ingrained. Okay, so finally, what are some tips and strategies? I'm just going to cover a little bit here. I mean, full on, what is wonderful to do is to actually go through a whole series of sessions to heal one's attachment style. And, I do have that available, as do other coaches. So I definitely recommend that if that's like a time in your life that you feel like that you can put that work in for it, reprogramming core wounds, working on needs, working on how to communicate and be more assertive and take yourself into account, all of that. But I think it's still helpful to know some tips and strategies in general and to start working somewhere, right? That's always helpful. Shifting things up, and it's hard too, right? Like shifting patterns, trying to start making some changes and seeing how things shift, it can be really helpful, always. Okay, so my main strategy here, so this is for the anxious, preoccupied person themselves, is to start taking yourself into account as a non-negotiable practice. So why do I say it like that? I say it like that because it's not going to feel natural. And so if you don't make it a practice, you probably won't do it. So that means going into conversations, having a sense of what it is you're trying to say and making sure you say it. And you don't like water it down before you've even said it. That doesn't mean you're not going to go into negotiation with someone you will. But you're going to go in and have a sense of like what it is you need, and that making sure that you're going to communicate that. And then afterwards, because of course it doesn't always go well, or maybe the conversation came up and you hadn't had time to think of it ahead, you can sort of dissect what happened, both for information for next time, but also to see if you want to go back. It doesn't have to be a one and done deal. Like if you realize that, let's say you back down from something immediately because you're used to doing that, and then you realized, hey, I really did want to like negotiate it for it a little more than I did, you can go back and have another conversation. So know that you can do that as well. So what if you're the partner, or the, the person in relationship with the person who is anxious preoccupied? So it can be helpful for a partner of an anxious preoccupied person to ask what they need in a negotiation or a conversation. So just trying to do that, sometimes because it's so unfamiliar for an anxious preoccupied person to take themselves into account if they're, haven't healed, they may not take you up on it, right? But over time, they're going to hear, their subconscious is going to hear that you're saying that you have that invitation. And at some point they will try to do that. They will actually take you up on it and say what they need, or maybe they will right away. So trying to accept what they bring in as what they need is important here. So that it doesn't mean you're not going to negotiate about it, but you're accepting what they're saying as their truth about what they need, right? So you accept that and welcome that. And then if you need to say, okay, but for what we actually do, how can I bring what I also need and what you also need together, right? So not trying to minimize, right, what they need, or say, oh no, you don't need that, right? Because they do have very different needs from you. Sometimes, let's say it's around communication or how often you connect in a day. If an anxious preoccupied person says, I love to text 10 times a day, they're not lying about that, right? They actually do want to connect a lot more than you. So to normalize that that's normal, it just isn't necessarily where it's going to end up in the negotiation and where you finally end up as your plan for going forward. So times to in particular think about doing this, both as the anxious preoccupied person taking themselves into account, or the partner of the anxious preoccupied person making sure to ask, for their perspective as well and what they need. Kind of obvious, but if the partner is bringing up something, if you as the partner are bringing up something yourself, that's a good time to ask what they need, or for the anxious preoccupied person to maybe realize, okay, wait a minute, it's starting to be a negotiation or something, a relationship communication going on here. Can I take a moment and think of what I need? And if you need to take a few moments to do that, certainly do, or ask for a different time to have the conversation. Of course, on the flip side, it could be that the anxious preoccupied person is the one bringing up something. And so in that case, again, the partner really accepting what they're bringing up, or, trying to welcome their perspective, or ask what they need if the anxious preoccupied person is bringing it up as if it's not as much about them, which can happen. And then the anxious preoccupied person, it can be great, like I said, if they can actually take some time to really think it through ahead of time and then analyze it afterwards. And then, of course, there can be these times when it's kind of coming from both sides, either more spontaneously that a discussion's happening, or the people are coming together to talk about an issue, the two partners, but it's not necessarily that one or the other is bringing something up as much as an issue in general has come up. So that would be another case where each party could try to take this into account as part of, all kinds of other things going on within the communication interaction as well. So really being proactive, right? Being both proactive and retrospective. That's what I would say. And then in the moment, what can you do in the moment? So this gets to my final tips here. I've got a pro tip for the AP themselves, and that is to check in with your body. So one good way to try to keep all of this going during the actual conversation itself is to check in with your body. Try to see, like, hey, we just decided this. Am I okay with that? Or I just said this and maybe it was backing down or something. Does that really feel okay with me? So trying to really listen to your body to see if something's really okay with you, or if you have more to say. And then the pro tip for the partner of an AP is that to let you know that an anxious preoccupied person very commonly also has a limiting belief or core wound around being too much. And so if you can know that and sort of head off that by saying, I really emphasizing, hey, I really welcome your perspective. Sometimes, I have to push back on it a little, because when we actually decide to do something, I have to take myself into account too. But I, emphasizing like, I really love hearing what everything's like for you and what things are like. And I love that you're so connective, kind of trying to be positive about those parts that are connective about the anxious preoccupied person. You may think you're encouraging them to somehow be more clingy, but it's really just the opposite, right? Really, when they hear that they're accepted for who they are, and that maybe they do have that strong need for connectivity, when they feel accepted for that, that's actually going to make them feel safer emotionally, and it's actually going to do just the opposite and be a really good thing for your relationship and for how you interact, and they won't feel so anxious. I'd love to hear in the comments any questions you might have about all this, or if you have other tips or strategies to recommend to people, I would love to hear those as well. And always, you can let me know too if there's a topic you'd like me to cover in the future. Thank you for watching.